The tragic case of Carlos DeLuna, how an innocent man was sent to death row in Texas. What if the justice system got it wrong? Not just a little wrong, but death penalty wrong. What if an innocent man was executed, while the real killer laughed about it in bars, told people he did it, and kept walking free? Today, we're going back to 1983, to a gas station in Corpus Christi, Texas. A young woman is murdered. Today, we're going back to 1983, to a gas station in Corpus Christi, Texas. A young woman is murdered. Police arrive fast, they make an arrest even faster, and within hours, a 20-year-old man named Carlos DeLuna is facing a murder charge. He swears he didn't do it. He says the real killer was someone else, someone named Carlos Hernandez. Problem is, the prosecution told the jury that Hernandez didn't exist. They called him a ghost, just a made-up name to dodge guilt. The jury believed it, and 6 years later, Carlos DeLuna was strapped to a gurney in a Texas prison and executed by lethal injection. But here's the part that will chill you. Carlos Hernandez was real. He had a record, a violent one. He bragged about the murder, and he looked eerily similar to DeLuna. So, how did the justice system miss him? And what does this case say about the death penalty, mistaken identity, and the terrifying possibility that the state killed the wrong man? This is the story of Carlos DeLuna, a man caught in a tragedy of errors, a name that should haunt us. The night of the murder. Let's go back to a cold February night in 1983, Corpus Christi, Texas. Wanda Lopez was 24 years old, a single mother, working a night shift at a Shamrock gas station on South Padre Island Drive. It was the kind of job that didn't pay much, but it was steady. She needed the money, she had a young daughter to raise, and she was trying to build a better life. It was just after 8 p.m. when Wanda made her first call to the police. She told the dispatcher there was a man loitering outside the station. He looked suspicious. He was pacing around, holding something in his hand. Wanda didn't know what he wanted, but she knew she didn't feel safe. Police didn't arrive. A few minutes later, Wanda made a second call. This one was far more urgent. The man had come inside the station. He was holding a knife. You can actually hear the call. In the audio, Wanda's voice is calm at first, but you can hear it shift. Fear creeping in, then panic, then silence. The struggle begins in the background, and then the line goes dead. When officers finally arrived, they found the front of the gas station in disarray. Wanda had been stabbed multiple times. She was found bleeding behind the counter. She was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. Wanda Lopez died from her injuries. At the same time, officers were already searching the area for suspects. Less than 30 minutes after the attack, a man was spotted hiding under a pickup truck in a nearby neighborhood. He wasn't wearing shoes. He looked nervous. Police pulled him out and arrested him. His name was Carlos DeLuna. He was 20 years old. DeLuna denied everything. He said he didn't kill Wanda. He told police he'd run from the gas station because he was scared, but not because he was guilty. According to DeLuna, he had seen the real attacker. He said his name was Carlos Hernandez. DeLuna told police he knew Hernandez from the neighborhood. He described him as violent and dangerous. He claimed Hernandez had gone into the gas station, not him. But the police didn't buy it. They insisted Carlos Hernandez didn't exist. They said DeLuna made up the name to confuse the investigation. DeLuna was taken into custody and charged with capital murder. And just like that, the wheels of justice began to turn. Within hours of the attack, a young man had been arrested, charged, and accused of a brutal crime he swore he didn't commit. The media picked up the story quickly. A savage killing, a frightened community, and an alleged killer caught hiding nearby. But what no one knew at the time was that this case would become one of the most controversial in Texas history. Because not only did Carlos Hernandez exist, he had a long and violent record, and no one in the system took the time to look for him. Instead, they put Carlos DeLuna on trial for his life. Who was Carlos Hernandez? After his arrest, Carlos DeLuna kept saying the same thing. It wasn't me, it was Carlos Hernandez. To the police, it sounded like a weak excuse, like a man caught red-handed trying to shift the blame to an imaginary person. They didn't believe him. Neither did the prosecutor. In court, they called Hernandez a phantom, a made-up name, a distraction. But Carlos Hernandez wasn't imaginary. He was real, very real. And what's worse, he lived just a few miles away from the Shamrock gas station. He even looked a lot like Carlos DeLuna. Same build, same dark hair, same mustache. Their names were similar, but the difference was their history. Hernandez had a long, documented record of violence, especially with knives. He'd been arrested many times over the years: assault, public intoxication, domestic violence. And in several of those cases, he had been caught carrying a knife. Some were serious. The kind of arrests that could have raised alarms if anyone had checked. Even more chilling, Hernandez reportedly bragged to people that he had gotten away with murder. Friends and family later claimed he admitted to killing a woman at a gas station. Some said he laughed about it. But in 1983, no one followed up. No one brought him in for questioning. The police and prosecutors were focused only on DeLuna. In court, when DeLuna's defense attorney tried to raise Hernandez's name, it didn't go far. He didn't investigate Hernandez's background. He didn't ask neighbors or friends. There was no serious attempt to prove Hernandez existed. The jury never heard the full story. And so, the trial moved forward, with Carlos DeLuna painted as a violent killer. The prosecution pointed to his nervous behavior, the fact that he'd run from the scene, and the fact that he was found barefoot just blocks away. But they left out something critical. There was no physical evidence linking DeLuna to the murder. No fingerprints, no blood, no weapon. And still, DeLuna was convicted. Why didn't anyone check into Carlos Hernandez? That's one of the big questions this case leaves behind. Later, it would come out that Hernandez not only existed, but had a pattern. He often threatened people with knives, especially during robberies. And he had a particular habit. He liked carrying his knife in a brown paper bag. That same detail, a man with a knife in a paper bag, was what Wanda Lopez had described in her frantic call to police. But again, that connection wasn't explored during DeLuna's trial. In fact, years after DeLuna's execution, journalists and researchers would find arrest records, mugshots, and eyewitness accounts proving Hernandez's violent past and his connection to the area where Wanda was killed. It was all there, hiding in plain sight. But back in 1983, that evidence stayed buried. And a man who may have been innocent sat on death row while the real killer walked free. The trial and the evidence. Carlos DeLuna's trial didn't last long. In fact, from jury selection to sentencing, the entire process wrapped up in just a few days. It was fast. Too fast, some would later say, for a case that would decide whether a man lived or died. From the beginning, DeLuna's defense was shaky. His court-appointed lawyer had never tried a capital murder case before, and he didn't do much digging. There was no deep investigation into alternative suspects. No follow-up on Carlos Hernandez, the man DeLuna insisted was responsible. The lawyer didn't even call any expert witnesses. On the other side, the prosecution focused on DeLuna's behavior the night of the murder. They told the jury about how he'd run from police, how he was found hiding under a pickup truck, barefoot and breathing hard. They pointed out that he matched the general description Wanda Lopez had given before her murder, a Hispanic man in a white shirt carrying a knife in a paper bag. But what the prosecution didn't have was physical evidence. There were no fingerprints at the scene tying DeLuna to the murder. No blood on his clothes, no murder weapon ever recovered. The only real link was that he was nearby and ran. Still, the jury believed the case was strong enough. The defense didn't offer much to counter it. And DeLuna's own testimony didn't help. Nervous and soft-spoken, he didn't come across as confident or credible. He kept insisting he didn't do it, that Hernandez did. But remember, at the time, the state insisted Carlos Hernandez didn't exist. And so, just 2 days after testimony began, the jury returned a verdict, guilty of capital murder. Then came sentencing, and just like that, Carlos DeLuna, only 20 years old, was sent to death row. No appeals could stop what was coming. For years, he sat in a tiny cell, waiting for the state of Texas to carry out his execution. Occasionally, he'd talk about Hernandez. He never changed his story. But few listened. In 1989, 6 years after Wanda Lopez was murdered, Carlos DeLuna was executed by lethal injection. He maintained his innocence until the very end. The case was closed. But the truth? That was still hiding in the shadows. It would take nearly 2 decades and a team of relentless journalists and legal researchers to finally shine a light on what really happened. What they uncovered would shock even the most seasoned investigators. And it would raise a haunting question. Did Texas execute the wrong man? The investigation begins. It started with a name, Carlos DeLuna, a name that stuck in the mind of Columbia law professor James Liebman. Years after DeLuna's execution, Liebman was reviewing cases involving the death penalty. When he stumbled across DeLuna's file, something didn't sit right. The trial had been fast. The evidence seemed thin. And then there was that other name DeLuna had kept repeating over and over, Carlos Hernandez. By the early 2000s, Liebman decided to dig deeper. He assembled a team of his law students, and together they began one of the most detailed post-execution investigations ever conducted. They started combing through the court records, transcripts, police files, anything they could get their hands on. What they found was disturbing. First, they realized just how flimsy the original case had been. The prosecution had dismissed Hernandez as a figment of DeLuna's imagination. But was he? The team went to Corpus Christi, Texas. They knocked on doors, interviewed locals, tracked down relatives, old police officers, prosecutors, and defense attorneys. And soon, something chilling came to light. Carlos Hernandez was real. Not only was he real, but he was also known to law enforcement. He had a long criminal record. He was violent. He had a habit of carrying knives. And he had even bragged to friends and family about committing a murder at a gas station and getting away with it. People who knew Hernandez said he'd talked about it several times over the years, how someone else had taken the fall for his crime. Even worse, it turned out Hernandez and DeLuna were known to hang out in the same circles. They looked similar, were close in age, and both had histories of getting into trouble. One of the most stunning discoveries came from an old police photo. The team compared the photo of Carlos Hernandez with a composite sketch created from Wanda Lopez's 911 call description. The resemblance was uncanny. Some people who had seen the man near the crime scene now said it looked much more like Hernandez than DeLuna. So, how did this happen? How did police and prosecutors miss a man with a violent past, living in the same city and fitting the suspect description? It turns out they didn't miss him. They ignored him. Records showed that Hernandez had been mentioned in early reports, but investigators quickly decided not to pursue that lead. Maybe it was pressure to solve the case fast. Maybe it was a mix-up. Maybe they truly believed DeLuna was lying. Whatever the reason, it became clear that the justice system had failed, and failed badly. By the time Liebman's team released their findings, the story had become national news. Newspapers, podcasts, and even major networks picked it up. The case of Carlos DeLuna had become a symbol of everything that could go wrong with capital punishment. He had always said he was innocent, and now it seemed likely he was telling the truth. Final thoughts. A broken system. You might be wondering, if Carlos DeLuna was innocent, why wasn't that uncovered before it was too late? Why didn't he get a fair trial? Why didn't anyone, step in? Well, that's the part that really stings. From the moment DeLuna was arrested, the odds were stacked against him. He had no money, no real legal team, no power. He was 20 years old, scared, and sitting in jail, trying to convince people he wasn't the man who committed the murder. He kept telling anyone who would listen, "It wasn't me. It was Carlos Hernandez." There was no DNA testing in 1983, no physical evidence directly tying DeLuna to the murder. The entire case was built on a shaky eyewitness identification and the fact that DeLuna was found nearby, hiding under a truck. And yet the trial lasted less than a week. The jury deliberated for just a few hours. He was sentenced to death. At one point, DeLuna did get some help. A few advocates and journalists became interested in his case years later, including reporters who wrote about the inconsistencies. But the machine of the justice system had already moved too far. His final appeal was denied. And on December 7, 1989, Carlos DeLuna was executed by lethal injection in Huntsville, Texas. He was only 27 years old. Before his death, he told reporters, "I know that one day the truth will come out. And when it does, I hope it's not too late for somebody else." And in many ways, that's exactly what happened.
Maybe one day the truth will come out, and I'm hoping it will. Because if I end up getting executed for this purpose, I don't think it's right.
He had dreams until the end, too.
I was to get out, I think I would try to preach the word of God, man, because I've learned that while being here, that's the only way, man, that I can make it now.
The case became a symbol of what can go wrong when the system prioritizes speed over truth. When poor defendants can't afford proper representation, when courts are too quick to accept a conviction without digging deeper, and perhaps the most haunting part, Carlos Hernandez didn't stop hurting people. After DeLuna's execution, Hernandez continued committing violent crimes. If police had taken DeLuna's claim seriously, they may have prevented future victims. That's the tragic ripple effect of a wrongful conviction. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a question. If Carlos DeLuna, an innocent man, could be executed so easily, how many others have met the same fate? And how do we make sure it never happens again? Carlos DeLuna was likely innocent. That much we know, but he wasn't the only one. In fact, he may not even be the first or the last. Let's talk about Texas. Because when it comes to capital punishment, Texas isn't just on the map, it is the map. Since the death penalty was reinstated in the U.S. in 1976, Texas has executed more people than any other state. As of now, over 580 executions have taken place in Texas alone. That's more than a third of all executions nationwide. And here's the unsettling part. How many of them were innocent? Well, we may never know for sure, but there are serious red flags. Organizations like the Death Penalty Information Center have tracked at least 190 individuals across the U.S. who were sentenced to death and later exonerated, many of them in Texas. That means for every 8.3 executions, one person sentenced to death was later found to be innocent. Let that sink in. And that's just the ones we know about. The people who were lucky enough to be saved by new evidence, DNA testing, or a last-minute appeal. Carlos DeLuna wasn't that lucky. During the 1980s and 90s, the climate in Texas was intense. Tough-on-crime policies were popular. Politicians built careers on being pro-death penalty. Juries were often swift to convict, especially if the defendant was poor, had a criminal record, or couldn't afford a strong defense team. There was enormous pressure on law enforcement to close cases quickly, and that pressure sometimes led to cutting corners, rushed investigations, ignored evidence, even withheld information. You could say the atmosphere was more about convictions than justice. In Texas, posthumous exonerations are rare. That means even if someone is later found to be innocent after they've been executed, there's often no official reversal, no legal acknowledgement, no apology. Carlos DeLuna has still not been formally exonerated, and that speaks volumes. It speaks to a system that struggles to admit its own mistakes, a system that, in some cases, may prioritize finality over truth. Today, there's more awareness than ever before. DNA testing has become more common. Advocacy groups are louder, and public opinion on the death penalty is slowly shifting. But the legacy of cases like Carlos DeLuna's still lingers. Because when a system kills an innocent person, that's not just a tragedy. That's a failure. And if it happened once, it could happen again. Carlos DeLuna was 27 years old when he was executed by lethal injection in Texas. He had spent 6 years on death row, maintaining his innocence until the very end. But now, we remember, because Carlos wasn't just another statistic. He was a reminder of how fragile justice can be, of how easily someone can be lost in a system more interested in closure than truth. Even with the shadow of doubt hanging over his case, the execution went forward. And just before he died, strapped to a gurney in a prison chamber in Huntsville, Carlos looked through the glass at his family. And he said, "I want to say, I hold no grudges. I hate no one. I love my family. I hope they can carry on. I want to say, I did not kill Wanda Lopez. I love you all. That's it." Those were his final words. Simple, quiet, and haunting. Whether you believe Carlos DeLuna was innocent or not. One thing is clear. If there's even the possibility that a person was wrongly executed, then the system has failed. And for every failure like this, we have to ask ourselves, how many more? Because justice should be about truth, not just punishment, and certainly not silence. If you've made it this far, it means you're enjoying the story. If you're interested in more, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a great story. This is Liam. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.